Welcome everyone. Sammy, thank you for your shiurim over the last weeks. And today we start a topic that I like to think of as extraterrestrial planting in Shemitah, pots, greenhouses, hydroponics, and this will probably be, I would say, either a 2-part shiur or 2.5-part shiur, depending on how things go. I want to note that shiur, as well as the general learning in the Beis Medrash today, was sponsored Le'iloi Nishmas Malka Bes Rabbi Shaya Ubluma Zichrona Lebracha, in loving memory of our dear wife and mother, Maxine Besson, by Burl Besson, Kobe and Shelby, Robert, and Lisa. So her neshama should have an aliyah. Here's where we're going with this. The Torah commands us not to perform certain tasks in the land. As in when the Torah says, V'shavsa ha'aretz, the land shall halt, Sadcha lo sizra, you shall not plant in your sadeh, in your field, during Shemitah. So we've defined the boundaries of the land, right? We did that early on in the year. Within those boundaries, we described areas that have different degrees of Kedusha, the cities that were settled by Olei Mitzrayim, Olei Babel, neither, on purpose neither, or on purpose not the latter. But what we have yet to do is to define the term land. And we need to ask the following questions. Is cultivating indoor plants a violation of Shemitah? Is cultivating plants in a raised bed a violation of Shemitah? Also an important question. Is cultivating in a greenhouse a violation of Shemitah? If I grow plants in a mostly liquid hydroponic medium, is that a violation of Shemitah? So all of these are questions that really push the issue of what exactly defines land when we talk about not planting or cultivating in land. A couple of people just joined. Do you have the source sheet? Do you need me to re-upload? Natan, Zev?
I have a sheet.
You have it. Zev? Oh, don't know. Okay, invisible, inaudible.
Yes.
No.
That will be so.
No, Jeff, you have. Zev was
Yes.
asking.
Oh.
Okay. Yes, he does. Okay, excellent. So what I want to do is start by looking at how the Gemara and the Rishonim dealt with the issue of planting in pots and planting in a sheltered area. In areas of halacha that veer from Shemitah to, or deviate from Shemitah to Truma and Maser, to Bikurim, to Arla, and then ultimately, not this week, but next week, to extrapolate from there to the modern situations that we're looking into. So we start out by talking about cultivating in a sheltered area. Maybe the issur against cultivating plants is by definition outdoors. Maybe it's not indoors at all. So a possible basis for leniency appears in Yerushalmi in Arla, and that's what I brought you here as source Aleph. Rabbi Yochanan b'shem Rabbi Yanai, Ilan shenetau b'soch habayis chayiv ba'arla. If you plant a tree in your house, you are still obligated in or liable for Arla. Upater min ha'maisros, but Truma and Meiser do not apply. So Arla does apply. Truma and Meiser do not apply. I don't know if anyone here has had a tree in their house. I have had trees in my house. My wife currently does not sympathize with that idea, but we had an esrei oak tree in Allentown that grew that we had in our house, and it's beautiful and it's wonderful if you have the room for it, and you don't get bugs. But the question now is, from a halachic perspective, what's your status going to be? And the answer is, well, we're both, right? Our law applies. Truma and Meiser don't apply. Why? Dirsiv, aser ta'aser eis kol tuah zarecha hayotzei hasadeh. The assumption, very interestingly, is, of course it counts, until you have a pasuk that says it doesn't count. So the pasuk says, you shall separate Meiseros from that which emerges in the sadeh, in the field. Your house is not a field. Therefore, Meiser will not apply. Ubishvius tzricha. And now we get a very odd line. In Shemitah, tzricha, I don't know what the word tzricha means. Dirsiv, because the Torah says, on the one hand, Vishavsa ha'aretz, Shabbat Lashem, the aretz, as I underlined, shall halt for Hashem. Uchsiv, and a pasuk says, Sadcha lo sizra v'charmacha lo sizmor. You shall not plant in your sadeh. So what's the implication of the first pasuk, V'shavsa ha'aretz Shabbat l'Hashem? What would that indicate to us? That Shemitah should apply or should not?
Should apply.
Should apply, Nathanael says. Nathanael says this indicates that Shemitah ought to apply. Why?
Because Eretz would imply that it grows anywhere, not specifically the field.
Okay. So Eretz will take very broadly. Right? Eretz will take very broadly, even though I don't think of my house as Eretz. Nonetheless, it seems to be so. Now, that's a little bit odd. Zev is shaking his head.
Should
What?
use the word Adama.
Should he use the word Adama? Why Adama?
It's an Eretz. It's not Mechuber Eretz. It should be.
Well, frankly, I would have had the same question if you said Adama. I would have said, well, you should have...
Take a look at the both ways. I think it's equal.
Right. The truth of the matter is, I would not have intuited that Eretz included house, if not for the fact that I read the Gemara and see it placing it opposite Sadeh. You know, Sadeh, we've already established, doesn't mean your house, because you said that regarding Maestros. So once you say that, I understand Eretz does include house, but I would not have assumed that. Rav Sammy, you were going to say?
Similar, but I think in terms of the word land, it seems to be that it's the same as we say Eretz Israel, the land of Israel.
Right.
So if you live in Israel, you can live in an apartment, you still live in the land of Israel, which is not necessarily grammar.
Right. I was thinking along those lines. You could make the argument for those who are on the Zoom that, or Sammy says, you can make the argument that Eretz is a political entity, as opposed to a description of dirt, earth. It means Eretz Yisrael, and therefore wherever it grows within the boundaries of Eretz Yisrael, it's going to apply. Now, either way. I mean, it's clear what the Gemara is doing. My question is only how it got there, but it's clear what the Gemara is doing. What the Gemara is doing is setting up a problem. It says, Arla applies. Meiser does not apply. Shemitah, shrug. I don't know. I don't know what to do. There's no apparent psak. So the question then is, could that be a basis for leniency in our discussion and say, you plant things indoors, the Yerushalmi is not sure that the laws of Shemitah will apply. Can you say that? However, applying the Yerushalmi to our discussion falls apart. The Rambam brings the halacha that you are chayav for Arla indoors. He brings the discussion for Meiser as well. However, he omits the discussion when it comes to Shemitah. He doesn't bring it. The Merkavas HaMishnah, Rav Shlomo of Chelm, thinks that's for two reasons. Take a look at source base. The Rambam brings that as far as Meiser is concerned, you are biblically exempt from obligations for Meiser because of Sadeh. Only rabbinically are you chayiv if it's indoors. And the Yerushalmi is asking, what about for Shemitah? Are you chayav biblically? Sorry, I already raced too far ahead here. What he says is that the Rambam does not bring this as far as Shemitah is concerned, because the case that you're talking about there is Ilan Shenetau. If you plant a tree, the Rambam believes that Nitiyah in general during Shvius is Midivrei Sofrim, is rabbinic, and therefore the Rambam doesn't bring this discussion. V'shapir hishmit Rabbeinu bayazu. The Rambam omitted this from Mishnah Torah. The Rambam did not discuss it because Gzeras HaKasav is irrelevant if you're dealing with something that he believes to be Derabanan. That's the first explanation of the Merkavas HaMishnah for why the Rambam omits this. So, Sammy.
I think I understand, with Derabanan for two reasons, the Rambam just omitted it. Is that the point?
Well, his point is that the Gemara is irrelevant. If you believe that the issue of Ilan Shenita'o is a Derabanan, then the Yerushalmi makes no sense.
So the assumption is that if Shemitah Derabanan and it's therefore considered
Not Shemitah, Nitiyah.
Nitiyah Derabanan, so it doesn't matter, it doesn't make sense.
It doesn't make sense, yeah. Why are you telling me that... What do you mean Kein Deoraisa?
Deoraisa, when it comes to planting trees, I guess when we talk about planting
Well, that's Rav Lau's response.
But aside from that, it's just kind of, I don't quite understand. The point is that since they're Rabbanan, doesn't matter.
Not since the Rabbanan doesn't matter, but the whole patur of the Gemara is misguided. In other words, the Gemara is saying that you plant trees only in the argument would go, you plant trees specifically in a sadeh. Therefore, it doesn't apply in Shemitah, right? And the Rambam looks at you and says, I don't understand. The Torah's language of sadeh is irrelevant here because planting trees isn't the deraisa. Planting trees is the derabanan. The Torah wasn't talking about planting trees. Yes, and the Rambam is saying we don't. The Yerushalmi is following the view that planting trees is deraisa, and I don't hold that way. That's the first answer of the Merkavas HaMishnah. That's as far as an isser in planting. Second, he talks about the issue of gaining kedushas shvius, and what he writes here is that it's obvious to the Rambam that the produce gains kedushas shvius, even if it's planted indoors. That the Rambam took that as a given. And just like the Rambam, it's the second half of source base, but I'm going to skip reading it inside, just explaining it instead. Just like the Rambam omits that a grapevine planted in a hektish field is subject to me'ilah, right? Meaning you plant in a hektish field, what you plant is kodesh. The Rambam didn't say that because it's obvious. So too here, it's obvious to him that kedusha shvius applies. So really what he's saying is, what the Merkavas HaMishnah is saying is, the Rambam doesn't record the Isser from here, one way or the other, because he says it's irrelevant, and he doesn't record Kedusha Shvius because he believes it's obvious. Rav David Lau, in an article in Tchumen Yudalid, addresses this set of comments by the Merkavas HaMishnah. He says, first of all, as Rav Sami wanted to ask, even if you're going to say that the Yerushalmi is only about trees, nonetheless, the halacha of sadcha lo sizra applies to zriya, to planting in the ground, planting regular seeds. And therefore, the Rambam should have recorded the halacha for that. Rav Lau suggests that sadcha, and I'm not going to do this at length, he has a much longer discussion of this. I brought you a little bit of it here. He says, sadcha has the mitzvos lo saseh, vishavsa haaretz has the mitzvahs aseh, although he acknowledges that he doesn't have a logical explanation for it, but that's what he says. In which case, he says, the Yerushalmi was not really ending in doubt. The Yerushalmi was not in doubt. What the Yerushalmi was doing was it was actually giving us a halacha. It was saying that the mitzvos aseh, v'shavsa haaretz, apply to indoor planting during Shemitah, and that the lo sasehs, sadcha lo sizra, do not apply to indoor planting during Shemitah. So the growth has only kedusha shvius and no isurim of planting, and hence the Rambam's omission. So what he argues is you could come up with a basis for leniency from this Yerushalmi. That's really what it comes down to. He says you could argue for leniency based on this Yerushalmi to make a suggestion that what the Yerushalmi is doing here is not pointing out a problem in Shemitah and then just leaving it, Kedarko Bakodesh, because Yerushalmi likes doing that. But that's not what it's doing here. What the Yerushalmi is doing is it's pointing out the fact that the pasuk that teaches us Kedusha Shvius does apply in Eretz, which includes indoors, whereas the pasuk that says, hey, don't do that in Shemitah, only applies to Sadeh and will not apply indoors. Everyone on the Zoom okay with it?
Yeah, aside from that leniency, according to this, so what if you plant indoors, but you use soil from outside of Eretz Yisrael and bring it from Canada or something?
Right, so the issue of the soil from outside essentially is once you're mechaber it to, once you join it with soil in Israel, it's part of Israel.
But no, if you do it indoors, it's all Canadian soil, right?
Oh, so you're trying to add a dimension. In other words, I am indoors and I'm using soil that came from elsewhere.
Yeah.
So my answer to you offhand, and it's an offhand answer, take it for what it's worth, is that in the event that we view planting indoors like planting in Eretz Yisrael, then it doesn't matter where your soil came from. It is considered to be joining with Eretz Yisrael. Whereas if we're going to say that planting indoors is not part of Eretz Yisrael, then using Canadian soil didn't really change anything. So basically, there's no point in importing Canadian soil to Israel. That's really what it is. Just people.
Okay.
Rabbi, I think Rav Lau points out in his article that the Kedusha Shvi'it would not apply in the house because he's claiming that the laws of Kedusha Shvi'it are derived from the Lo Taseh. So therefore, the nafkamina would be that if you say the pasuk of the Lo Taseh doesn't apply in the house, then whatever grows in the house won't have Kedusha Shvi'it.
He's saying Kedusha Shvi'is. He says the assays are going to be applicable, but the Kedusha Shvi'is is not.
Because the Kedusha Shvi'it is derived from the
It's derived from the Los assays. So I have to go back and take a look again then, because I have to admit that I looked at it thoroughly when I gave shir on this last Shemitah cycle, and much less thoroughly this time. So maybe I misunderstood. Maybe I was reading too quickly.
You're right, and like he says, for whatever reason, that you can't have an assay because they're on Derabbanan levels. If Shemitah is Derabbanan, and we argue that only the assay applies indoors, or Rabbanan, I'm not going to apply the assay.
So Sammy is disagreeing with your read, Tanel.
I think he said both. I'm not disagreeing.
I'm looking at the words right now.
He's adding. He's not disagreeing with you. He's adding to you.
Oh, okay.
He's saying that the Rabbi Lau says both.
You go right there with the Tanel, and Rabbanan, he says we can't apply it in the end anyway.
You hear Rav Chaim? He says that Midoraisa it's like you, but Midorabanan it's not. So I need to go back and read the article because, like I said, I only read the part that I needed to read. The Dabka, I didn't go through the whole thing thoroughly this time around.
You only apply Lo Taseh to Rabbanan, not Lo Taseh to Doraisa. I think you're right. You only apply Lo Taseh to Rabbanan.
I'm going to pass on the discussion of the Kedusha Shvi'is, possibly come back to it in the beginning next time. But I want to move on to the rest of the question of this Yerushalmi Arla and the rest of everything else. And read Rav Lau later. So, number one, Rav Lau is giving me reason to be lenient, potentially, saying that the Losa assays, at any rate, will not apply, only the assays. Leave aside the Kedusha Shvi'is question. But also, if I don't take his resolution of the Yerushalmi, if I take the way the rest of the world read the Yerushalmi, and say that the Yerushalmi ends up being uncertain, and Shemitah today is, after all, a Derabbanan according to many poskim. Go back to Rav Sammy's shir last week, and you'll hear all about just how sure we are that Shemitah is a Derabbanan Bizman Hazeh. So, if that's true, I can say Safek Derabbanan, and therefore be lenient regarding planting indoors. So the Pas HaShulchan said that. Pas HaShulchan, if I remember correctly, was a Talmud of the Vilna Gaon. And take a look at source Daled, where he says, HaYerushalmi nishar b'sa, I added the word HaYerushalmi, nishar b'safek, dichsiv v'shavsa ha'aretz Shabbat l'Hashem, dichsiv sarchalos izor v'chamachalos izmor, mashma b'galui. That since we use the term sadeh, it's only if it's exposed, as if it's outdoors. V'nishar b'baya, and it remains as a question. Ulakaman be'rarti d'rabbeinu v'achronim echriyu d'shvi'is b'zman hazeh d'Rabbanan. Ulafizeh abaya lakula. Since I'm going to show you that Shemitah is d'Rabbanan b'zman hazeh, therefore we can be lenient. The Chazon Ish thought that was a very interesting idea. Yeah, Zev, you were going to say?
No? Oh, sorry, I muted.
Oh, okay. So take a look at source Hay, where the Chazon Ish says, hang on a second. V'ikar hayesod shel pas hashulchan zal lahakel b'sveika ledidan eino muchra. He says, I do not find that compelling. D'yesh lomar, kevan de'ikar hasafek b'de'oraisa, since the suffix is in what is fundamentally a biblical matter, meaning the suffix is not about a derabanan, the suffix is about a deoraisa. Do the laws of planting trees apply indoors on a deoraisa level? Does that apply? V'azlina l'chumra, and you're going to go l'chumra and say, well, I guess the answer is yes. Memela gam l'didan azlina l'chumra. Therefore, we will have to go l'chumra as well. Rabbi Binyamin Zilber in the Bris Olam in Aleph Kuf Yud Zayin brings this as well. Both the doubt about, maybe we could say it's a derabanan, and the rejection of it in Kuf Yud Ches. The Mincha Shlomo, or Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, goes to town on the Pas HaShulchan. He really did not like what the Pas HaShulchan had to say. Take a look at source Vav. This came up, this Mincha Shlomo, way back in the beginning of the year when we were talking about Zoreah. And the beginning of Chorzman, when we talk about Zoreah and what is Zoreah, and we talk about planting in pots and all of those things. So Mincha Shlomo makes a bunch of points. First point that he makes is that the Ravid in Hilchos Maaser, Perek Aleph, Halacha Yud, is the one who reads this Yerushalmi as being unsure. Well, the Ravid is the one also who says Shemitah is deoraisa bisman hazeh. So if you're going to adopt the Ravid's view that the Yerushalmi is besafek, that the Yerushalmi is unsure, you also have to accept the Ravid's view that says that Shemitah is de'araisa. You can't do a tarteh desasri, right? This is always the classic problem with people trying to grab a psak here and a psak there. You can end up with a self-contradictory position. That's no good. That's objection number one. Now, the truth is, I don't think objection number one is really such a strong objection, because the Rav is not the only one to think the Yerushalmi is besafek. I mean, that's also an issue. But even without that, even without that, I mean, everybody reads that Yerushalmi and thinks that, except for Rabbi Lau. And Rav Kook, yes. The issue of that split of Aseh and Lo Saseh is also in Shabbat Haaretz. But that's number one. Number two, he says, the understanding that Truma and Meiser apply in a house is not a special gezerah. It's a result of comparing the case of the house to the case of a pot with a solid bottom. If so, then for Shemitah, we should also make the comparison between what's in a house and the pot. And just like Shemitah applies to a pot with a solid bottom, which we have to come back to, so too it should apply to a house, he argues. Further, he says, the Ridbaz and the Chazon Ish don't like this Pas HaShulchan. He did this very odd thing in Mincha Shlomo. Did you notice that? Take a look. Look inside. You see the part where I bolded? Right below the part where I bolded. He did something that I don't really understand. He said, Ach gam below zeh hisigu al hapas hashulchan haridbaz b'Yerushalmi sof maisros. Right? You see that? He brings you the ridbaz, and then he says, V'yesh gam shetamhu. And some also express shock. Dekeven she'ikar hasafek hu b'doraisa ... He brought you the Chazon Ish's idea, but he brought it as yesh gam shetamhu, and I don't understand why. The Chazon Ish is his Rebbe. He quotes the Chazon Ish all the time. Why did he write yesh gam shetamhu? I have no idea.
It wasn't the Chazon Ish's idea. I mean, there's a whole discussion when you have something that the origin is doraita, and whether it would still, even though the suffix is doraita, whether it would still be doraita.
Absolutely true. But the Chazon Ish is the one who launches it here against the Pas HaShulchan, and I just like, it's so odd. He's so quick to quote the Chazon Ish normally. I don't understand why he's doing this. In a Hanami, what Chazon Ish is referring to as a standing discussion, which is much broader. But in terms of bringing it in here, I thought that was strange. I don't know why he did that, unless the answer is because others said it also, and therefore he says yesh gam shetamhu. I don't know. But that's an objection of his. And then he says va'ol al kulana. He says the biggest point is who dekeven sha'arambam u'shar poskim lo yavio klal hach bayad Yerushalmi kashmod l'smocha zel lakula. He says, if the Rambam doesn't mention the Yerushalmi, what's the default position? Right, the default position is Asur. Right? We say no planting, no cultivating plants in Israel. I have a Yerushalmi that suggests maybe there's room to be lenient, and then says, but we're not sure. then the answer is it's Aser. If the Rambam doesn't bring the Yerushalmi, the default should be Aser, not Mutter. It's an odd thing to do. And then he also notes the Gemara in Moed Katan, which we've seen any number of times, in which the Gemara mentions that the word sadcha is extra. Well, it's not extra if I use the word sadcha in order to exclude a house. So he says that would then be damaging in our read of the Gemara in Moed Katan. So it's a nice idea to try to bring in this this Yerushalmi as a starting point. Maybe it can be grounds for some leniency, but it's difficult. Stronger potential leniency comes from the rules of other way around. Possible stringency comes from the rules of Meiser in a house. If you flip over to page 2, source Zion, the Rambam writes, Elon shenito b'soch habayis pater mi-maisros. You plant a tree in a house, you are exempt from Meiser. Why? The pasuk we've seen, hasadeh, field. V'yeroyeli shu chayiv b'maisros midivreihem. It appears to me, though, that you're chayiv in Meiser midrabanan. Sharei te'ena homedes b'chatzer chayiv la'aser peroseh emasafan ke'achas. Because if you have a fig tree in your yard, you have to separate Meiser if you gather the produce all at once as opposed to one by one. So you're rabbinically chayiv in Meiser. So applying that to Shemitah, the Yerushalmi may be taken to indicate that you're pater, but at least you should say it's aser midrabanan. So the Chazon Ish posits a sfek sfeika l'chumra here in source Ches. He says yesh l'tzadeid sheyesh sfek sfeika lahachmir. How do you like that? Dilma keha Rambam de isura derabanan ika. Number one, maybe we follow the Rambam that there is in fact an isur derabanan. Ve'imtim tzalomer keha Raivad. And even if you're going to tell me that you're going to follow the Raivad, Dilma bisman habayis. Bayis de'oraisa. V'hashta de'rabanan. Maybe in the time of the Beis HaMikdash, the rules of Bayis were in fact in Isser de'oraisa, and now it's a de'rabanan, usfek sfeika lahachmir b'de'rabanan machmirinan. And therefore we have grounds to be strict. In other words, even according to the Raivad, by the way, I brought you in source test. I'm not sure why I brought it after instead of before. But the Raivad writes, "V'araya she'evim echatzer eina klum dechatzer shnito shazara hainu sadeh v'lo ala mikbanami kava." The Raivad said this idea of extrapolating from chatzer to bayis is irrelevant. Nonetheless, the Chazon Ish argues that maybe there was a biblical obligation for bayis in the time of the Beis HaMikdash, which would then be derabanan today. So therefore, I have two reasons to be machmir. Number one, maybe the Rambam is right regarding Meiser, and number two, maybe Bayit was different in the time of the Beis HaMikdash. Nonetheless, the Chazon Ish eases off a little bit and says, all of this is Meiser, not Shemitah, and therefore he says in Yud, Ein lilmod shvius mi Meiser, de'efshar de'ikilu chachamim b'shvius mishum chayei nefesh. Maybe we're more lenient for Shemitah than we are for Meiser. So the upshot of this is that the Rambam, again, just to sum up this idea, the Rambam in Hilchos Meiser says you're chayiv midirabanan for Meiser that grows in the house. Could I extend that to Shemitah to say it's a derabanan? The Chazon Ish seems to think there is room to be strict, because maybe I follow the Rambam, and even if I follow the Raivad, maybe there's still reason to be strict. However, he then says, but maybe not. Rosh Shlomo Zalman Auerbach in Ma'adanei Eretz as well as in Minchas Shlomo. I brought you Ma'adanei Eretz for it, but you can see it in Minchas Shlomo. It's in Aleph Mem Aleph Dalid. Quotes Rav Yonah Navon, the Nechva B'Kesef. He wants to say that if you have a solid pot in Shemitah, it's Aser, because the laws of Truma and Meiser apply in a solid bottom pot. So he is linking the two, but then he says, as I underlined, we don't necessarily compare gezeros. So we're not necessarily going to apply what they said for Truma and Meiser to what they say regarding Shemitah. So the idea of learning the stringency from Meiser liability to Shemitah is unlikely. So right now I have a Yerushalmi that I might be able to resolve lahakel, maybe, but not so fast. I have a Meiser precedent that I could use to draw strict conclusions, but again, not so clear-cut. But what you can get is a possible limited leniency out of a stringency about sheltering plants. Take a look at source Yud Beis. Right? We've learned that already this year. You guys are well past Parak Beis in Shvius. Mishnah says, Mizam tios v'korchen osan v'kotmin osan. We've talked about mizahamin already this year. I'm not going to go into what mizahamin is right now, but there are certain treatments that you're allowed to do for saplings during Shemitah. V'osin lehem batim. Before Shemitah. V'osin lehem batim, and you are allowed to make houses for them, umashkin osan, and irrigate them ad Rosh Hashanah. Until Rosh Hashanah, until the beginning of the Shemitah year. I am not going to allow you to make houses for your trees for during Shemitah. Says the Yerushalmi in Yud Gimel, Rabbi Yossi Amar Rabbi Avuna, boy, ma bein hamizayim la'osa la'bayis. What's the difference between being mizayim and making a bayit? The bayit you're not allowed during Shemitah. Mizayim, under certain conditions, you are allowed to do. So Yerushalmi says, "Hamizayim eino ela kamoshiv shomer," because mizayim is fundamentally preservative. Right? Go back to our okmei ilana discussion. The difference between okmei and avruye, that which preserves what's there, versus that which will improve it. And he says, mizayim is only maintenance. Bayit osa latzel v'higedela machamasan. With a house, you give it shelter. That provides shade. Apparently, too much sun can be bad for this tree. You are now doing something that will help it grow by giving it shade. So says the Yerushalmi. So that right now is strict, right? If I were to stop here, Reb Chaim, if I were to stop here with Osin Lambatim or until Rosh Hashanah, I would conclude you can't cultivate something in your house during Shemitah. That's what I would have assumed. However, the Chazon Ish says, not so fast. Because I take a holistic view of the effect of being indoors. It's not simply about, is the thing under a roof? It's a question of what kind of growing experience is my tree having when it's inside of the house? Is it a good place for a tree to grow, or is it a bad place for a tree to grow? So take a look at the Chazon Ish in source Yadalid. He says, "V'hadisnan b'shvius," our Mishnah, "Va'osin lehem batim," I added in brackets, only until Rosh Hashanah. "Eino inyan l'noteya b'bayis." He says, don't compare that to planting in your house. Da'asam hagag mitzad ha'ilan o sheish gag chalonos ba'alachson. He says, the case that they were describing there in the Mishnah and in the Yerushalmi is talking about where you have a roof that is beside the tree, or the roof has some openings in it. And the point is, it's not a 100% shelter. It will help to reduce the degree of sunlight that the tree is going to get. However, it's not going to prevent the tree from getting access to rain, from getting access to dew, from getting access to the air. The point of that kind of a shelter is it improves the growth of the tree. When you plant in your house, it's an inferior growth opportunity. It loses out on the benefit of all the rain, the benefit of the clouds, the benefit of the air, the benefit of the sunlight. I'm taking tlalim as clouds. I don't know if he means dew and is just using the word for clouds. But in any case, the house is actually a bad thing. So therefore, the Chazon Ish says, what the Yerushalmi says, when the Yerushalmi says, and the Mishnah says, that I'm not allowed to create a shelter for it, only applies if it's overall a good growth experience. In your house, though, we may have room for leniency. Now, first of all, are we clear on that? Understood?
But it's only negative, though.
What's only negative?
The house is completely negative.
So that's where we're going. What defines a non-helpful house to satisfy the Chazon Ish here? So first of all, the roof has to keep out all the elements, right? That was clear in the language of the Chazon Ish there. I also brought you another Chazon Ish in Maisros in source Tezvav. V'ikar pitur mishum schach hamoneas hageshem v'es hatal. There he uses the word tal. V'es haruach v'es hashemesh v'ein zu derech gidul hativ'i. It's because you're keeping out rain, dew, wind, sun. That's not the normal way to grow things. The Bris Olam in Shvius in Aleph Kuf Chav Ches says it has to keep out the rain. He doesn't mention the sun and the wind, but I can't think that he's okay if it's just keeping off the rain. But now the question, which I assume Rav Chaim was leading to, is: can you apply this heter when you're dealing with a greenhouse? Obviously not. The greenhouse is designed as an optimal growing place. See, I wonder a little bit about this, because part of it depends on what your alternatives are. In other words, if I wanted to grow I have a plant growing in my house right now. It is a 3-year-old pepper plant. I took a pepper one day, green pepper, red pepper, whatever it was, took out some of the seeds, put them in a pot, and it's growing. Year after year after year, it keeps on going. If I had planted that pepper plant outside, number one, I wouldn't have gotten anything in the first place. But let's pretend I had gotten something year one, it would have died during the winter. That would have been it. Indoors, it just keeps on growing. It's incredible. So it's not so much that a house is a negative growth area. It depends on what your alternatives are. So I'm not really so sure. Like the greenhouse, you could argue, is fundamentally negative also, compared to being outdoors. It's just better than being outdoors in the wintertime. So that's the problem. But you understand why I'm mistopic. That's... Yeah. Right. Rosetti points out the whole thing is speculation. And it's true. Merosh ve'atzof, it's speculation. The other piece that goes along with this, by the way, is do you need walls in order for it to be a house? The Chazon Ish writes in source Tezayin, right, Shvius Chavbeis Aleph, V'adaz nota dehikar tali b'kisoy v'ulay tzarach mechitzas yud tvachim gamkein. He says, really, the roof is what matters. However, you might need walls of 10 tefach as well, and that leads to this great discussion Rav Efrati brings in Atzitcha Nakuv B'Chamamot. Rav Efrati was a Talmud Muvak of Rav Elyashiv. And he brings this great discussion about it. I brought it in Yud Zayin. I didn't have the patience to retype it, and it wasn't cut and pastable. But I brought it here for you. The suggestion that maybe for walls, you could count lavud. You could count lavud for walls. I thought that was among the funnier things in this sugya. Meaning, if your point is supposed to be that this is keeping off the sun, right, and keeping off the rain, and it's an inferior growth thing, then lavud really ought not to work. I see you reading it carefully, so I'll read it out. He says, "Begidra mechitzos sheistapik behen maran being the Chazon Ish, and do like tzarach gam mechitzos yud tvachim." So he says, regarding this question of the mechitzos, do you need 10 tefach? The Chazon Ish wasn't sure. So he quotes the Rishimos Harav Peles to say, mechitzos od besafek al pi hachoshavos maspik letzarach chumra afilu. Kolomar, avim tzara mechitzas tzara chumra, sagi b'mechitzas hamo'ilos b'elchos Shabbos. It's enough to have mechitzah that works for the laws of Shabbos. Kana mikanva, kana al gaveyan. You can have a doorway maybe. Ulefizeh, he doesn't do that. But he says, Ulefizeh, av mechitzah shel lavud havi mechitzah. Maybe a mechitzah of lavud would count. So you have a string, and then you have a couple of tefach, and then another string. You can see them doing that for an entire field in Israel. And when someone comes along and says, what are you doing? How could you plant there during Shemitah? They say, oh, no. You see the strings. We're actually okay. Don't you hold from lavud? Yes, and a lavud roof perhaps as well. No, a lavud roof I don't think even he would go with. But he goes on to say Rabbi Elyashiv was not happy with this suggestion. But it's a very interesting idea. Bottom line out of all of this is that at the very least, it's unclear that a roof helps, and it's likely that a roof does not help. However, the Chazon Ish will combine it with a separate heter that in the end ends up allowing certain forms of greenhouses. And that brings us to the discussion of atzitz nakuv and atzitz she'eno nakuv. So I like to translate atzitz nakuv in a positive way. If you sit there every time saying a pot without a hole versus a pot with a hole, it becomes confusing. So I translate atzitz nakuv as a pierced pot, a pot with a hole, and atzitz nakuv, atzitz she'eno nakuv is a solid pot. Okay, no holes in it. That's the idea. If a pot has a hole in it, it is the same as the ground. I'm not discussing now what if it has a hole in it but it's on an upper floor of a house. That is a discussion we'll get to next week maybe. But if you have a pot that's sitting on the ground and has a hole in it, all the laws are the same as if it's in the ground. So on Shabbos, if you move that, you have violated potentially an Isser De'oraisa. Don't do that. It's tolesh because the plant in it is considered to be connected to the ground. So I told you I'm getting to hydroponics, but not this week. Hydroponics is next week. But the basic rule is if it has a hole in the bottom. By the way, if it's a vase with flowers in it, it's got a hole in the bottom. You have other issues. Just saying. The sphina can get away with it. You can't get away with it. So regarding a solid bottom pot, the sources get complicated. I have the Yerushalmi in Shvias Daled, which we discussed when we talked about Zoreya earlier this year. It's in source Yirches. In Bodkines Hazroim Ba'adama Be'atzitz. You may not test seeds during Shemitah in a pot if you're growing it in a soil medium. Bodkinos and Biklalim Ba'atzitz. You're planting it in fertilizer, right? Remember we talked about coarse fertilizer, fine fertilizer. Are you leaving them in? Are you not leaving them in? But the Yerushalmi says no testing seeds in a pot during Shemitah. But which kind of pot is this? Is this a pot with a hole in it, or is this a solid bottomed pot? Standard Mefarshim in the Yerushalmi present this as a gezerah lest to appear to be planting. In other words, you're not planting. You're just putting the seeds in. You want to see if they germinate, and then you're going to stop. But it looks like planting. But because it's only an appearances issue, it may be viewed as different from planting in Eretz Yisrael that's prohibited, and yet still be prohibited. In other words, it could be, you could make the argument that planting in a pot does not count. However, it counts for this purpose of appearances. Nonetheless, there is a strict view in the Rambam. The Rambam writes in Source Yirches, "Ve'ein bodkin es hazrem ba'atzitz malei afar, al bodkin osad ba'atzitz malei galalim." The Rambam brings you basically the Gemara's statement. You're not allowed to test the seeds in a pot unless it's a pot that is filled with manure instead of a soil medium. That's the Rambam. The Radbaz there, in a comment about using galalim in a pot, seems to think that this is a derabanan as a gezerah, and it will apply equally whether it is nakuv or eno nakuv, whether it is solid or pierced. Take a look at source Chaf, Ubai Tarti. He says the leniency requires two things. Number one, it's an atzitz, it's a pot, and it's malei galalim, it has manure. Aval galalim bekarka upper ba'atzitz low, but if it's manure in the ground, or if it's dirt, a soil medium in a pot, that's not going to help you. Umistabra, and then he continues to say, logically, da'afilu ba'atzitz nakuv delo echmiru kol kach. Even if it's a pot that has a hole in it, they weren't so strict. And my point in this, and everybody's point in this Radbaz, is simply that he believes that the Gemara is talking about a solid pot as well as a pot with a hole in it. This is a gzera derabanan that will apply equally. That's the position of the Radbaz in reading the Rambam. However, the Chazon Ish says, I don't know what you're talking about. Literally, that's what he says. Source Chaf Aleph, Aval ein lanu makor lazeh b'Gemara. This is all brought in like this one bracketed line in the Chazon Ish. In general, if you've noticed, I haven't been reading it aloud, reading the Mar Makom aloud, but the Chazon Ish, a lot of his comments on this issue are in Chaf Beis Aleph in Shavuos. So in the middle of it, he just has a little bracketed 1.5 lines where he quotes this Radbaz, and he says, "Aval ein lanu makor lazeh b'gemara." He says, "I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know where you got this idea from. For an Isser Derabanan." He thinks the Yerushalmi is talking only about a pot that has a hole in it. That's as far as he's concerned. I can't hear you well.
Yes, there is. Yerushalmi says you can't test.
Right. Right, but he says, what's your basis for saying that there's Gzeir D'Rabbanan on Atzitz that is Eino Nakov? He says the Yerushalmi, by default, he assumes Atzitz means Nakov. Yeah, but I'm the Chazon Ish, and therefore I can tell you what Atzitz means. Okay. So the Chazon Ish does not think that there's reasons for stringency here, and we have a Yerushalmi in Demai, which could be a basis for leniency. The Yerushalmi in Demai is dealing with the case in which, let me start back one step. There is a halacha that I have to separate truma and meiser from produce. Simple and straightforward. I don't have to separate it all from the immediate produce that I am eating. I can have 2 batches of produce, and as long as they are together, I can separate from one on behalf of the other. However, if my 2 batches are named batch A and batch B, okay? Batch A definitely requires truma and meiser. Batch B is a suffix. Maybe it's demai. It came from somebody who may have actually tithed it. I am not allowed to separate truma and meiser on behalf of A, which is vadai, which definitely needs it, from batch B. That's no good. Right? That's clear and straightforward? Makes sense? Right? You should not be allowed to tithe from suffix for vadai, because you could end up separating from something that was already tithed. Right? Or that didn't need it. In which case, it's invalid. That's a basic rule. So the question now is, as the Yerushalmi discusses, what if I have produce that grew in a solid bottomed pot and produce that grew in a pierced pot? Am I allowed to separate truma and meiser from the stuff that grew in the solid pot on behalf of that which grew in the pierced pot? That's the Yerushalmi. It's in source Chav Beis. Rabbi Bun Bar Chia b'shem Rabbi Zera. Atzitz asu oso safek. He says atzitz is viewed as safek, and here the Yerushalmi uses the word atzitz, but you know it's talking about atzitz sheino nakuf based on the context. So here there's no doubt. He says a pot that has no hole, a solid pot, is safek. That's the initial statement of the Yerushalmi, and therefore don't tithe from a solid pot for a pierced pot. To which the Gemara then asks, Vatanenan, but wait a minute, I have a Mishnah that says, Atzitz nakuv mekadesh bekerem v'she'eno nakuv eno mekadesh bekerem. I'm reading it as our edition of the Yerushalmi goes, which is that a pot that has a hole in it, if you put that into a vineyard, creates kilei hakerem, mixed species in the vineyard, meaning a pot with a hole in it is considered to be attached to the ground. And if it doesn't have a hole in it, if it's a solid bottom, it doesn't create kilei hakerem. So therefore, a solid bottomed pot is not considered to be connected to the ground. It doesn't create kilei hakerem. So there's no suffix, is my problem. There's no suffix. It's not part of the ground. So the Yerushalmi answers, misafek, out of doubt. Thank you. What in the world are you talking about? What did that mean? What was the answer? How did you answer the question? You have a simple and straightforward problem. You're telling me that if stuff grows in a pot with a solid bottom, maybe it requires true and meiser, maybe it doesn't. Maybe it's considered connected to the ground, maybe it's not. But I have a halacha that says it doesn't create kilei hakerem. It's not connected to the ground. What are you talking about? Yeah, misafek. So you did nefesh commentary to the Yerushalmi. Says, yeah, the Gemara's answer is, I don't know. That's what it means when it ends misafek. He reads the Gemara the way we just read it. The Mishnah had said you should retithe because the solid pot is safek, and then he asks, so why doesn't it create kilei hakerem? The way he reads it is slightly different. The way he reads it is slightly different. But the way that he did, let's take a look at it. In Chav Gimel, he says, Rabbi Bun Bar Chia Amar B'Shem Rabbi Zera, Atzitz Asu Oso Safek. Meaning, Mashra Inu B'Mishnah Shein Ma'asrim B'Shem Nakov Ala Nakov, when we said in the Mishnah, don't tithe from a solid pot for a pierced pot, Lo Mipnei Shahaya Pashot L'Tana Sha'atzitz Shenu Nakov Lav Ka'aretz. It was not because it was obvious to the Mishnah that this is not considered part of the ground. It was unsure. So therefore, we don't tithe from this solid pot for the pierced pot. Vishoel, and then the Yerushalmi asks, and I have a Mishnah in Kilayim which says, if it has a hole in it, it creates kilei hakerem. Bad idea. Mixed species in a vineyard. Don't do that. But if it doesn't have a hole, it doesn't create kilayim because there is no zriya. He says the Yerushalmi ends by asking, but it should create kilei hakerem misafek, out of doubt. That should still happen. Questions the Yerushalmi. Kach hi hagirsa. He says that's the proper addition. Klomar, im yesh safek shemu ka'aretz maduena makadesh. If you think it might be considered part of the land, then it should create kilei hakerem. V'Gemara lo ona, and the Gemara doesn't answer the question. So the conclusion of the status of a solid pot is unclear. The Ridbaz had very cool access. The Ridbaz had access to a manuscript of the Vilna Gaon of the Yerushalmi with handwritten notes. So look at what he says. He says, because you're reading the Gemara wrong. That's not the Gemara's text. In Source Chav Daled, he says, Rabbi Bun Bar Chia B'Shem Rabbi Zera said, Atzitz Asu Oso Safek. So far, so good. Atzitz has uncertain status. Vatnan Atzitz Nakov Mekadesh Bekerem B'Shem Nakov Einu Mekadesh Bekerem V'Kadesh Misafek. But then, I don't understand, it should create kilei hakerem out of doubt? And then he has an extra word. B'chutz ha'aretz. It's talking about outside of Israel. And he says, Kain girsas hagra zal b'ksav yad kodsho b'Yerushalmi shetachas yadi. He says, that's in the Gra's own hand in a manuscript that I have. And all of you who don't have access to it should just feel bad. But that's what he says. I know what the Yerushalmi should say because the Vilna Gaon wrote it in my Yerushalmi. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. So that's his, but he says, that's the way to read the Yerushalmi. So the back and forth in the Yerushalmi this is talking about chutz la'aretz, which is a derabanan for kilayim to begin with, and therefore safek is mutter. That's the Yerushalmi's conclusion. However, what it also means still is that a solid pot is safek. Whether you read it the Yedid Nefesh's way, or whether you read it the Ridbaz's way, the conclusion is safek. So the Chazon Ish says, yeah, here's the way to read the Yerushalmi. Chafei. Ve'efsher delo garsinan misafek. He says, no, maybe we don't have that addition. I don't know what he means when he says efsher delo garsinan. Does he mean this would read a lot smoother without that word? I don't know what he means. He says it's possible that we don't have this girsa. It reminds me of the Nitziv's approach to girsos. Or the Bach's approach, perhaps, to girsos. But he says, there's no problem here. Ela mefarish Rabbi Zera, the asu oso safek. What the Rabbi Zera is saying is, they consider it a safek, aval min hadin patur. But really, letter of the law, it's not considered connected to the ground. Umaisi raya mehada eno mekadesh, and it's bringing proof to that from kilayim, the fact that it doesn't create kilei hakerem. If it did create, if it was really uncertain, then it would be considered to create kilei hakerem at least misafek. So he says, I think that what the Yerushalmi is doing is simply explaining that a pot with a solid bottom is not considered to be connected to the ground. That's what it's trying to tell me. And it's bringing me proof from the kilei hakerem. And that word misafek that you have there at the end, just erase it. And he says, therefore, don't assume that we are strict on a solid pot out of safek. It's not true. It's not so. Look at what we did with kilayim. So that becomes a very interesting basis for leniency. So what exactly is a solid pot, for Sammy? No, what you going to say? Okay. So what constitutes a solid pot? So the Chazon Ish has a vague comment here. He says, if you look at Chavav, Amnam, Yesh lachkor achar haminhag v'im avoseinu noagu bo iser in koach lahatir v'hahalacha rofefes v'halach achar haminhag. He says, you have to investigate and see what's considered a solid pot and what is not. And if our ancestors were strict about a particular structured pot, then we can't be lenient. The halacha is rofefes, and here he's channeling for you a Yerushalmi, which appears in a bunch of places, that wherever the halacha is rofefes, if you are unsure, if you're shaky about the halacha, so go see what people do. The great example of that, of course, is coming up this year with Erev Pesach being Shabbos, and the question of how you get the Korban Pesach to the Beis Hamikdash, or how you get the knife. It's not really the Korban, that's the problem. How do you get the knife to the Beis Hamikdash if you didn't leave it there beforehand? But in any case, the Chazon Ish says, yeah, we have to go see what people do. Why is this a problem? Why isn't the pot either obviously solid or not solid? Well, for starters, because certain materials are assumed not to be solid even when they are. By which I mean, if you have a pot made out of certain materials, it may be automatically considered like it is pierced, even though it looks solid to you. We're also going to need to talk about drainage holes and the status of drainage holes, but that I can see, it's 11:26. We're not getting to that this week. But take a look at the Gemara in Menachos, in source Chav Zayin. It's also a little bit in the Yerushalmi in Chala, Perek Beis, but I chose the Menachos one as easier to work with. Tani Chada. Shebegag v'shebechurba shebe'atzitz v'shebespina mevi v'korei. He's talking about where you are obligated to bring bikurim. There are two pieces to bring in bikurim. One is bringing the bikurim, and the other one is reciting the psukim. So if something is bona fide bikurim, you bring the bikurim, and you have a mitzvah of reciting the psukim, Arami Oved Avi, right? The ones that we know of from Parshas Kisavo and from the Haggadah. So you say those psukim there when you bring the bikurim. So I have one brisa that says, if something grows on a roof, something grows in a ruin, something grows in a pot, something grows on a boat, it's valid as bikurim. The mevi v'korei. Tanya idach mevi ve'enu korei. But I have another brisa which says, no, for all four of these you bring bikurim, but you do not recite the psukim. I don't understand. So the Gemara gives you differences between the brisas for each of those cases. I'm not going into the differences between one roof and another, one ruin and another. I'm focusing on the latter two cases, the pot and the boat. Atzitz lo kasha. There's no problem as far as the two conflicting brisas regarding pots. Kan b'nekuva, kan b'she'eno nekuva. One is talking about a pot with a hole in it, one without. If the pot does not have a hole, then you bring the bikurim, but you don't recite the psukim. Sfina lo kasha, and the two boat cases are also not a problem. If it grew on your boat, kan b'sfina shel eitz, kan b'sfina shel cheres. We distinguish between where the boat is made of wood and where the boat is made of clay. So I open the question to you. Both of these cases, I hope, are cases that don't have holes, because it's a boat. Okay, we're going to come back to that because it's not so clear cut, but that's our assumption going in. So my question to you is, which of these cases is considered solid, and which of these cases is considered to have a hole, and why? Is it the wood-bottomed boat, or is it the clay-bottomed boat? What would you say? It's too bad I can't do polling on this. I don't have the rights on this one. Don't read my chart. I worked on that chart. My question is, how would you say it? It's 11:29. So I'm going to pause here and ask through without looking at my chart first. Because it's not at all clear as you read this Yerushalmi, and it matters in terms of understanding the nature of a solid bottom pot. But what we've established then today is, number one, in terms of a house, they are planting in a shelter. We have a basis for potential leniency if it's in a shelter which inhibits growth, as opposed to a shelter which is actually helping it to grow. And we have a possibility of a leniency, a stronger possibility of a leniency really, if it's in a pot that has a solid bottom. However, we need to define what that means, having a solid bottom. We have to talk about what if it has holes in the sides, what if it grows over the sides of the pot. There's a lot that we have to talk about in this regard. So God willing, we will continue with that next Friday. Shkoyach. Thank you. Thanks everybody for participating. Have a good Shabbos.